Welcome to the programme. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been meeting Russia's President Vladimir Putin in a high-stakes mission to avert war in Ukraine. Mr. Scholz is expected to repeat warnings from other Western leaders of tough sanctions against Russia if it launches an attack. A media conference is expected to take place shortly. That summit in Moscow between the German and Russian leaders comes on a day of fast-moving developments in the growing standoff over Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry has announced that some units deployed near the Ukrainian border have completed their tasks and are returning to their bases. But other drills are continuing. Speaking in the last hour, the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says he's seen no evidence of a Russian troop withdrawal from the Ukrainian border.
So far, we have not seen any sign of de-escalation on the ground. Russia has amassed a fighting force in and around Ukraine, unprecedented since the Cold War. Everything is now in place for a new attack. But Russia still has time to step back from the brink, stop preparing for war, and start working for a peaceful solution.
That's the NATO Secretary-General there. Well, let's get the view from Germany and Ukraine. Our diplomatic correspondent in Kiev is Paul Adams. But first, let's speak to our Berlin correspondent, Jenny Hill. Jenny, we are expecting, or we have seen Olaf Scholz now in Moscow, but a very different dynamic to the one that Angela Merkel had with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, Olaf Scholz is just 2 months into the job as German Chancellor. And of course, he doesn't have the diplomatic clout of his predecessor. She spent years also developing a relationship with Vladimir Putin. It helped, of course, that she spoke fluent or near fluent Russian. So he is going into these talks at a bit of a disadvantage, if you look at it from that perspective. On the other hand, he's going into these talks as the leader of a country which has historically, economically, socially very close ties to Russia. You could argue that actually he and his advisors perhaps have a bit more of an understanding of the way that Russia works, perhaps even the way that Vladimir Putin works as a result. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, his advisors, government sources in Berlin, very keen to downplay expectations, saying they don't expect any kind of significant breakthrough. The purpose of his visit is, of course, twofold, and it's pretty much the repetition of what other Western allies have been saying to President Putin so far. First of all, if you invade Ukraine, there will be severe consequences in the way of economic sanctions. But secondly, Chancellor Scholz is very keen to try and find ways to de-escalate the crisis, to try and keep dialogue going. He, of course, as leader of Germany, is very keen to push forward the so-called Normandy framework and the Normandy format, under which France, Germany, Russia and Ukraine have in the past got together and tried to effect a ceasefire in the east of Ukraine. Talks in that format have been continuing here in Berlin, actually, at the end of last week, at advisor level only, not senior advisors or leaders even. No breakthrough there as yet, although some here in Berlin say, well, just the very fact you had someone from the Russian side actually coming to talk, coming to the table, is a degree of success, if that's how you want to measure it at this stage.
Let's go to Kiev and speak to our Paul Adams. Paul, while the flurry of diplomacy continues and Olaf Scholz is in Moscow there today, a mixed picture on the various different parts of the Ukrainian borders. Just tell us a little bit more about what's going on.
Yeah, I think a very mixed picture, it's safe to say. As you've heard, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary-General, doesn't say that they have seen any significant sign of a de-escalation. There was scepticism also voiced here in Ukraine. The Ukrainian foreign minister put out a statement saying that, we have, I think in his words, a rule not to believe what we hear, but to believe what we see. And they're also pointing to the fact that they have seen in the last few days signs of Russian military advisors and inspectors, I think that was the term they used, moving around in those separatist areas in the Donbass, kind of checking to see if the separatist forces are properly prepared for the possibility of an outbreak of hostilities. So they're not seeing any signs of a withdrawal. Obviously, everyone is going to be watching very closely to see if there's any tangible evidence of this. We think that if what the Russians are referring to is forces on the eastern side of Ukraine, that is the area adjacent to those separatist areas, no indication of a withdrawal to the north, where the Russians and the Belarusians continue to hold military exercises, which exercises that still have 5 days to run. And yesterday we were hearing Western officials saying that they had seen signs that Russian troops there had moved even closer to the Ukrainian border. So I think it's a lot too early to make any definitive judgment on what we're seeing on the ground.
Yeah, and while this is all happening, MPs in Russia have recommended to Vladimir Putin for him to recognise 2 Russian-backed breakaway regions in the eastern part of Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, they have put this to Mr. Putin. They were presumably under some instructions to make this appeal to Mr. Putin. This didn't come out of the blue. This had been in the works for some time, and essentially what they're saying to the Russian leader is, you now have the option of recognising these 2 separatist areas, the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent countries. And of course, this is all part of the kind of diplomatic and political ratcheting up that goes alongside the military build-up. Whether Mr. Putin will decide to give them that recognition and what that recognition would mean in practice is a little hard to tell.
OK, Paul, thanks so much for that update. And of course, Jenny from Berlin as well. Let's get the latest from Moscow now, where those talks between the German Chancellor and Russian President have been taking place. Our correspondent, Caroline Davis, has sent us this report.
Is this de-escalation or a distraction? Russia says that these tanks are returning to their bases now that some of the military drills have finished, exactly, they say, as they had planned. The West is uncertain about whether this makes any difference to Russia's ability to invade, and for weeks it's warned of a gap between what Russia says and what it does.
The intelligence that we're seeing today is still not encouraging. We've got Russian field hospitals being constructed near the border with Ukraine in Belarus only can be construed as a preparation for an invasion. You've got more battalion tactical groups actually being brought closer to the border with Ukraine, according to the intelligence that we're seeing. So mixed signals, I think, at the moment.
Despite suspicions and tensions, both sides have said that discussions are not over.
There are signs from Moscow that diplomacy should continue. This gives grounds for cautious optimism. But so far, we have not seen any sign of de-escalation on the ground.
After warnings over the weekend, many will be hoping that this means that both sides are feeling more positive about diplomacy. But there are still big questions about what a diplomatic deal might look like.
The German Chancellor was in Moscow to meet President Putin. The 2 countries are closely linked by trade, by history and by gas supply.
Undoubtedly today we will devote a significant portion of our time to discuss the relations to the situation in Europe and to the security of those discussions that are now unfolding around it, including things happening around Ukraine.
It's clear that we now have to talk about the difficult situation regarding security in Europe. I've spoken about it with my French colleague. I'm glad that it's possible to talk about it. The most important thing is that states talk to each other to solve it.
But in a different part of Moscow, Russia's State Duma voted to ask Putin to recognise the separatist-held areas in Ukraine as people's republics. If he does, relations would sour even further. In Moscow's cold sunshine, signs of warmth can be deceptive, and a resolution is still out of reach. Caroline Davis, BBC News, Moscow.